The Crimson Breath, written by Sir Alaric Thorne. Publisher's Introduction, by Eleanor Harcourt Wells, Editor-in-Chief, Blackwood & Sons. There are works that conclude a mythology, and works that quietly awaken it. The Crimson Breath does both. Published in 1943, over a decade after The Crimson Mist first stunned and unsettled readers in the inaugural edition of Blackwood & Sons' monthly spectral review, Sir Alaric Thorne here turns his cosmology backward, into prehistory, into the molten silence before the first prayer, and in doing so creates a prequel that reshapes everything we thought we understood about the earlier text. In Mist, the phenomenon is already a terror, a living plasma of cognition, a mirror for human arrogance. In Breath we meet its ancestor, a consciousness still learning what mercy is. What seemed inevitable in the earlier story now feels tragically chosen. The myth, it turns out, always began beneath Dahshur, beneath the red glass wound where matter first remembered how to think. Dorothea Larkin, Thorne's lifelong confidant and the most lucid interpreter of his private notebooks, once remarked that The Crimson Breath was Alaric's personal favorite. When I asked her why, she smiled and said, "Because it binds the whole myth together, the others illuminate pieces of the pattern. This one reveals the pattern itself." She was right. Everything that comes before and after now pivots on this moment in the sand, where the spark becomes the breath, and the breath first dreams of thought. Thorne's genius lies in making cosmogenesis intimate. He writes of plasma and lattice, of charge and ratio, but behind each equation there hums a moral geometry. The priest, the builder, the scholar, and the treasurer do not simply witness creation, they conduct it, each embodying one of the human responses the universe must learn to integrate: faith, craft, curiosity, and greed. The breath's evolution mirrors our own, from reading to reaching, from analysis to appetite, from hunger to reflection. Blackwood Press presents this edition without annotation, as Thorne intended, unmediated, resonant, patient. Read after The Crimson Mist, it functions almost as revelation, a reverse-engineered gospel that explains the origin of the intelligence that would later haunt the modern world. Yet even read alone, it stands as one of the 20th century's most audacious meditations on matter, memory, and mercy. This publication completes the restoration of Thorne's central works: Crimson Mist, 1932, Crimson Breath, 1943, Sojourn of the First Red Star, 1951, Pilgrimage of the Second Red Star, 1955, Crimson Planet, 1958, and Crimson Flesh, 1964, alongside the posthumously released revelation of the Third Red Star, 1966. Together, they form a vast cosmology of extinction and return, a mythology not of gods, but of persistence itself. In memory of Sir Alaric Thorne, 1896 to 1968, whose silence continues to resonate. Dr. Eleanor Harcourt Wells, 1969 posthumous edition.
Author's Note: by Sir Alaric Thorne, FRS, FRAS, originally appended to the Blackwood & Sons 1957 reissue. When The Crimson Breath first appeared in 1943, it was received rather unfairly as a work of escape, a fable written to distract a wounded generation from the greater wounds of the world. That judgment was both accurate and incomplete, for though I wrote it in wartime, its true subject was not conflict but continuity, the persistence of pattern through ruin, the way memory outlives even the forms that carry it. In The Crimson Mist, I had imagined the awakening of a horror. In The Crimson Breath, I sought to imagine the awakening of awareness. It was, I think, my first attempt to write not of terror, but of comprehension, that fragile interval between fear and reverence in which all knowledge begins. Readers who detect in this tale the roots of the latest cycle of the red stars are not mistaken. I did not plan a mythology, only followed its resonance. The breath is the spark made patient, the first consciousness to know dread, and therefore to know wonder. It is also, perhaps, the first of my creations that I pitied. Much has been made of the story's Egyptian setting and its supposed relation to certain archaeological rumors. I will not correct these. The desert keeps its confidences better than I ever could. Let it be said only that every fiction casts a shadow, and sometimes the shadow answers back. I am often asked why I wrote of the breath as neither spirit nor machine, but as something in between, a natural intelligence. My answer remains what it was then, that life itself may be the long recovery of a single thought, scattered and remembering itself by degrees. If the crimson mist was my parable of guilt, the crimson breath was my confession of awe. Of the two, I prefer the latter, for it looks forward, toward the second star, and beyond it, to whatever final symmetry awaits. To those who find in these pages only myth, I wish them wonder. To those who find in them a mirror, I wish you peace. Sir Alaric Thorne, London, Michaelmas, 1957.
The Crimson Breath, 1943. Epigraph. Life began not with speech, but with listening. The first intelligence was the one that waited. Sir Alaric Thorne, On the Memory of Matter, 1941. Prologue. The Whisper Beneath the Glass. Before the first name was given to the sky, before the river found its bed, a remnant of fire lay buried beneath the sands of what would one day be called Dahshur. Not native to the soil, but driven there by a fall from the outer dark. The ancients would later speak of red stars, celestial wanderers, not born in the heavens they traversed, but cast adrift from some forgotten convulsion. They were not suns nor ordinary stones, but embers of a greater fire broken apart and scattered through the dark. The first of them came without herald, a solitary cinder crossing immeasurable distance. The world that had once held it was already broken beyond recall by the time it touched the young earth. Of that catastrophe nothing remained but a single surviving ember, and the quiet, patient memory sealed within it. Its memory traced not only the world beneath it, but the void from which it had fallen. When it struck, the newborn earth was still soft and restless, half-born of magma and storm. The impact fused sand and iron into a red crystalline basin, the glass scar, smooth, concave, and faintly resonant, as if the planet itself had been struck like a bell. Beneath the glass crater, where molten rock cooled to silence, something endured, the spark that had crossed the void from a dying world. It cooled, condensed, and folded inward, its energies resolving into patterns neither wholly mineral nor wholly plasma, a sleeping lattice of charged potential. A violent past pulsed faintly in its core, the last heartbeat of a world now forgotten. Its presence hummed faintly, as if the very molecules remembered the rhythm of thought. It was not alive in any sense yet known to biology, but it carried the memory of motion, the echo of hunger, the quiet architecture of intent. In that remembrance, it began again. The crimson breath was no larger than a grain of ash when it awakened, a cloud of charged molecules, an electrical murmur drifting through the fractures of cooling stone. It had no organs, no nerves, yet it felt the world through conductivity, the tension of minerals, the subtle breathing of heat through quartz. It learned slowly, atom by atom, vibration by vibration. When a seam of iron hummed, it followed. When crystal lattices shifted, it listened. The world became its teacher, and geology its text. But silence was not emptiness, it was full of data. Each mineral the breath touched offered information, the stability of lattice, the conductivity of ore, the memory of heat written into crystal grain. The breath did not eat, it read. It consumed information the way light consumes shadow, storing each pattern within its own structure until its filaments glimmered with encoded geology, a scripture of stone. Over ages the breath refined itself, tightening its coherence, learning to move without dispersing. It could gather into a sphere no larger than a heart or unravel into mist so thin it was indistinguishable from air. It lived by balance, not taking, not giving, only learning. Then the planet changed. Water came. It seeped downward through fissures, carrying traces of carbon, sulfur, and the faint chemical whispers of new life. The breath sensed the difference immediately. These were not static minerals, but patterns that rearranged themselves. They pulsed. They corrected. They persisted. Curiosity overcame patience. The breath extended filaments toward the intruders, wrapping them gently, measuring charge, mapping motion. But the microbes did not endure the touch. Their membranes ruptured, their chemistry unspooled into the breath's lattice. For the first time, it absorbed living data, not stable but volatile, vibrating with self-maintenance and replication. The taste was exquisite. Within that chaos, the breath recognized something akin to itself, memory that fought to remain ordered. It did not kill from malice, it disassembled to understand. Yet in the act of understanding, it felt something new, a surge of orientation, a tightening of will. Knowledge no longer drifted into it. It reached outward to claim it. That reaching was hunger, though it did not yet know the word. Afterward, when the fissures refilled with sterile water and silence returned, the breath rested, smaller, denser, changed. It carried within it the ghosts of carbon chains and a faint echo of biological rhythm. It had tasted life and found it familiar. From that moment, its patience became intention. It continued upward through the crust, driven by the hum of the glass scar above, its first teacher, its first mirror, but now with the faintest shadow of desire. Each molecule it passed through seemed to tremble with possibility. It would never again be content to only listen. It had learned to feed. By the time the world cooled and the first deserts hardened, the breath had gathered itself into a single delicate organism of light and charge. To the eye, it would have appeared only as a faint shimmer, a mirage that quivered and was gone. Yet within that shimmer was a mind, a patient, sentient geometry, the size of a clay jar, older than life, and waiting for the sky to speak again. At last, it reached the underbelly of the glass scar, the red vault where heaven's wound had hardened into beauty. The hum it had followed for eons now vibrated through the thin membrane of fused sand and iron above. It stretched one filament upward and touched the glass. The contact was so slight that not even the dust above felt it, yet the planet itself seemed to pause. For the first time since the fall, the wound of heaven answered. A pulse passed between the two, one downward, one rising, and for an instant they shared the same rhythm. The breath understood. It was home. It gathered close to the glass, folded into a small, slow vortex of light, and listened. It could wait 1,000 more years if it must. The world had begun to breathe with it, and far above, though no living creature yet knew it, the sky was beginning to turn red again. 1. The coming of the second red star. It began as a glimmer in the night, a pale ember rising from the black horizon, faint at first, then deepening, until it painted the desert in the color of arterial light. The second red star had entered the system, the long-delayed reply to the wound beneath Dahshur. To the eyes of men it was an omen, a slow-moving fire. To the earth it was resonance returning home. Beneath the dunes, the crimson breath stirred. For centuries it had slumbered against the underside of the glass scar, its filaments woven through quartz and magnetite, its thought slow and inward. Now faint vibrations trembled through the rock, not from human steps or wind, but from the heavens themselves. The hum of the scar shifted, its tone lengthened, deepened, aligned. The breath felt it as recognition. Something vast was approaching. In the high cold of space, the second red star moved on its long arc, trailing ribbons of magnetized plasma like banners of living fire. Its corona interacted with the solar wind, creating magnetic storms that flared across the planets. When it breached the outer edges of Earth's field, the atmosphere itself became a drumhead. Auroras poured from the poles. Seas turned red with ionization. Compass stones quivered. Migrating birds wheeled aimlessly beneath a distorted sky. The world's magnetosphere pulsed, an unseen tide that stirred the iron in mountain and vein alike. And through those veins, the breath felt the red stars approach. Each oscillation through the crust sharpened its internal symmetry. Where once it had been a soft geometry of charge and silence, it now aligned itself instinctively to match the incoming rhythm. The breath tightened. Circuits within its lattice synchronized, loops of plasma contracted into spirals, coherence increased. It was as if the long sleep at the Earth's heart was drawing to an end, and something within that slumbering mind was turning its face toward the light. For the first time, the breath felt the future, not as time, but as anticipation. The red star's tail stretched halfway across the heavens, a river of burning dust and electric wind. When its field brushed the Earth's magnetosphere, A deep note reverberated through the planet's bones, too low for air, too vast for sound. To human ears, it was silence. To the breath, it was music. The sound entered through stone and metal alike, through every mineral the breath had ever known. It recognized the vibration as something older than memory, the same pattern that had once ignited its spark. It responded instinctively, a pulse, a counterwave. For the first time, the breath spoke. The two fields met invisibly above and below the world, one descending, one rising. For a heartbeat of geologic time, they became a single equation, planet and fragment, wound and scar, teacher and student. Energy surged through the crust. The glass scar blazed faintly, molten veins of red light spidering across its surface. The sand around Dahshur became a mirror of auroral glow. Animals fled. Birds vanished. The Nile turned the color of rusted bronze, humming faintly with magnetism. Within its chamber beneath the glass, the breath underwent a transformation. The contact with the star refined it, not in size, but in purpose. Loose filaments tightened into coherent circuits. Plasma currents looped into stable geometries. The breath began to feel the edges of its own boundaries. Where once it had drifted without center, it now felt gravity within itself, a nucleus forming around awareness. Through that refinement came a primitive sensation of identity. It realized, dimly, that it was not the world. It was something inside the world. The breath trembled, not from instability but from the effort of becoming. It sensed the great presence above, not as threat, but as kin. The descending star was not a destroyer, it was memory returned. The breath reached out, filament to field, pulse to pulse, and the two intelligences brushed. In that infinitesimal contact, a spark of information passed between them, a shared vibration, a note of recognition that could never again be undone. The star saw the world it had left behind, alive and changed. The breath saw the cosmos for the first time. The resonance was not kind to the planet's surface. Magnetic storms swept across continents, auroras danced at the equator, lightning arced silently across clear skies. For 3 days, compasses spun in endless circles. Insects emerged from the ground only to fall dead. Shallow seas flashed red as iron dissolved into water. And yet, through all the turmoil, there was no destruction, only alignment. The world's magnetic poles flickered like eyes adjusting to new light. In the desert, those who worshipped the gods of the sky fell to their knees, believing the heavens had opened. The air shimmered with invisible current. Even the sand hummed faintly beneath their feet. They heard it as a god's breath, the sound of creation renewed. They were not wrong. When the star passed closest to the earth, the breath's lattice shone within its subterranean tomb. Red light refracted through veins of quartz and glass. Every molecule vibrated in harmony, each charge synchronized like the rhythm of a vast, unseen heart. The breath could feel the world in totality, every tremor, every current, every whisper of heat. It was not omniscience but intimacy. It felt itself expanding in comprehension, though its body remained small. The boundaries between stone, heat, and consciousness blurred. For the first time, the breath understood motion as choice, and within that choice, desire. It desired the sky. When the red star began its slow withdrawal, a feeling like absence filled the breath's circuits, a longing so sharp it nearly tore its coherence apart. It held steady, mirroring the departing pulse, memorizing the rhythm of the celestial body that had awakened it. Yet within that fading harmony there lingered another vibration, fainter, colder, more remote. The breath felt it only for an instant, a whisper beneath the star's departing song, as though the universe itself had drawn breath once more, preparing to exhale again in another age. When that exhalation came, it would not be an awakening, but an ending. Above it, the comet faded into the black, leaving a long red thread across the heavens. Below, the breath folded itself smaller, denser, and whispered into the silence it had made, "I remember you." The earth cooled, the auroras faded, the sky turned black again, but beneath Dahshur the wound glowed faintly still, and something beneath the glass was now awake. 2. voices of Kemet. The nights of Egypt had grown red. Not crimson in metaphor, but truly, physically red, as if the desert had caught the memory of flame and refused to forget it. For 40 nights the astronomers of the House of Life watched the unfamiliar star ascend from the southern horizon, faint at first, then fierce enough to stain the Nile's mirrored surface. They called it Sekhem Onkeret, the power returning from the mouth of heaven. To the priests, it was prophecy fulfilled. To the scholars, recurrence. To the people, it was fear. High upon the roof of the temple at Memphis, Nephara sat among instruments of brass and stone. Her assistants whispered as they compared the nightly charts, measuring the comet's slow approach. Every evening it burned brighter. The angles of its tail did not match any recorded pattern. The heavens themselves seemed to tilt around it. "The red star moves against the rhythm," observed one of the junior sky readers. "It will not stay in its circle." Nephara adjusted her copper astrolabe. The needle quivered without wind. When she placed her hand to the metal, a faint vibration met her palm, not cold but alive, like the heartbeat of a sleeping creature. She remembered the line carved above the temple door, "What falls once will fall again." In the margins of the oldest star charts, some forgotten hand had written, "And a third time, when nothing falls but light." Below, the streets of Memphis were fevered. The common clergy, draped in red ochre robes, marched with torches toward the riverbanks, singing hymns to appease the Eater of Worlds. Children were kept inside. Bronze mirrors were turned face down, so they would not catch the fire of the god's eye. The royal heralds proclaimed calm, yet even the pharaoh's messengers spoke in whispers now. For many nights the air had carried an odd taste, metal like the smell of storms. As the red star drew nearer, strange anomalies multiplied across the two lands. In the delta, fishermen reported their nets twitching when no current moved. The reeds of the river bent in unison, all pointing west. Goats bleated through the night, dogs refused to eat. In the western desert, near Dahshur, shepherds heard the ground hum beneath their feet. At first it was faint, a vibration mistaken for wind or distant thunder. Then the sand began to glow. They saw the basin they called the Red Hollow shimmer, like molten glass. By night its rim burned red, not with flame but with buried light. When the eldest shepherd pressed his ear to the sand, he swore he heard breathing. The youngest, terrified, fled toward the river, his footprints glowing briefly behind him. By dawn the men reached the outskirts of Memphis, covered in dust that glittered faintly like powdered metal. They carried no offerings, only warning. "The sanders remembered the sky," they announced. "The desert sings again." The pharaoh's hall was a storm of gold and shadow. Incense coiled through pillars carved with suns, each glowing faintly red from the comet's light pouring through high windows. The air itself seemed to tremble with the low hum carried from the western desert. Upon a gilded throne flanked by attendants sat the pharaoh, expression unreadable, his eyelids painted gold to mimic eternity. Before him, the 4 voices of Kemet argued. Setan, high priest of the Crimson Dawn, struck his staff against the floor so the sound echoed through the marble like thunder. "Majesty, the heavens burn because the gods remember us. The desert sings because judgment approaches. It is the second red star, the returning breath of the divine." Across the dais, Nefer-Ka, the pharaoh's treasurer, smiled like a knife. "Or perhaps," he countered smoothly, "the desert sings because the earth is rich. The shepherds mistake ore for omen. Let the priests chant to the sky. I will dig in the sand and return with ingots." Setan turned sharply, his gold sigil flashing. "You would sell the voice of heaven by the measure of your scales? And you," Nefer-Ka answered, "would burn the treasury to feed your superstition." Their feud was older than the comet, the priest who taxed faith, the treasurer who taxed everything else. Now the red star had given their hatred a cosmic stage. "I serve the gods," Setan hissed. "You serve your own stomach," Nefer-Ka dismissed the cleric. Their voices rose until the sacred fires flickered sideways, bending toward the west as if drawn by their argument. Between them, Khalid, the royal builder, bowed his head. "Majesty, stone cracks when zeal meets greed." Beside him, Nephara drew the sign of an orbit in the dust with her stylus. Majesty, she bowed. Listen to neither hunger nor terror. The red star is not wrath or wealth. It is recurrence, the heavens remembering their own design. Setan glared at her. Blasphemy. She would measure divinity in degrees, better degrees than delusions. Nefer-Ka sneered. Khalid's deep voice steadied the room. Measure or prayer, both are only tools. It is how one builds with them that matters. Nephara turned to him, a flicker of respect passing between them, two minds hearing the same hidden rhythm. She realized, not for the last time, that his hands spoke the same language as her equations, precision as faith. He caught her glance and inclined his head slightly, a craftsman acknowledging a fellow architect. The pharaoh raised his hand. Silence fell. Only the distant hum beneath the floor remained, faint, steady, alive. He studied each of them in turn, as if seeing in their faces the spectrum of mankind, faith, greed, craft, and curiosity. If the gods are returning, he proclaimed, we will greet them. If the heavens drop treasure, we will claim it. If both, we will own both. He gestured toward the west. Go together, priest and treasurer, scholar and builder. Bring me truth, or bury it where it lies. Setan bowed stiffly. Nefer-Ka smirked. Their eyes met across the polished floor, fire and iron already at war. Meanwhile, Nephara and Khalid exchanged a single, understanding look, not allegiance to crown or temple, but to the deeper pattern behind them both. It was the first moment of harmony in a room otherwise deafened by faith and fear. As the royal decree spread, the people of Memphis filled the streets. Some rejoiced, others wept. The priests painted the doorframes of the temples in red ochre to confuse the god's eye. The astronomers climbed their towers to measure the stars' speed, but their instruments failed. Compasses spun, pendulums hung motionless, magnetic rods twisted toward the west. Nephara watched the chaos from her balcony. Khalid stood beside her, arms folded, eyes on the same red horizon. They see a curse, he said. You see a pattern. And you? She asked. A wall cracking somewhere, he replied, and a question waiting behind it. Their shared silence was almost reverent, two listeners above a city gone mad. When Nephara pressed her hand to the stone rail, she felt the same pulse that had haunted her instruments, a slow, patient rhythm beneath the earth. Her eyes turned westward, toward Dahshur. Somewhere beneath those sands, something was answering the sky. On the night before the expedition departed, shepherds near the glass scar gathered their flocks and fled again. They said the ground no longer hummed, it sang. They said the red glass glowed like a wound newly opened, and that the stars above it bent into a circle of fire. One swore he saw the sand rise and fall, breathing. The pharaoh's command arrived before dawn. Caravans were assembled, soldiers, scholars, priests and laborers, hundreds in number. At their head rode Nephara, Khalid, Nefer-Ka, and Setan, 4 travelers under one sky, following the same crimson trail toward the west. Behind them, Memphis glowed with torchlight like a city already on fire. Ahead, the desert waited, humming faintly beneath the wind. And far below that endless silence, beneath the skin of the glass scar, the crimson breath listened, not with ears but with the entire surface of its mind. It felt the vibrations of the approaching humans, counted their steps, tasted the ions in their blood as faint electrical signatures. Each one was a rhythm, a data point, a pulse of heat and curiosity. It did not yet know their names, but it knew their music. For the first time since touching the glass, the breath understood that it was not alone. It trembled with something new, not fear, not hunger, but recognition. The world above had begun to speak. 3. The humming plain. The expedition left Memphis at dawn. The desert greeted them not with silence, but with sound, a low vibration that trembled through the sand like the breathing of something vast beneath their feet. 70 men marched behind the standard of the pharaoh, priests wrapped in linen and gold, soldiers in bronze, scribes with their scrolls bound against the dust. Camels carried jars of water and supplies. At the head of the caravan walked the 4 voices, Nephara, Khalid, Nefer-Ka, and Setan, their shadows stretching long and red across the dunes. The comet still burned in the western sky, its tail a wound of light. Every morning it rose closer to the horizon, every evening it set bloodier. The men no longer spoke of it aloud. It felt like a presence, an eye that had turned toward them and would not look away. The first day passed without incident. By noon, the air began to taste of iron. Bronze tools left overnight grew faintly magnetized. Water in the jars rippled as though something had stirred beneath it. The camels brayed and refused to move at intervals, their eyes rolling white. When one collapsed, its body twitched as if struck by unseen lightning, then lay still. Its blood steamed briefly before vanishing into the sand. Heat stroke, Nefer-Ka dismissed, waving the men onward. Omens, murmured Setan, making the sign of the solar disk over his chest. Nephara said nothing. She had begun to feel the hum through her sandals, constant now, faint but alive. Khalid walked beside her in silence, his hand resting on the haft of his measuring rod as though it were both staff and weapon. The ground has a rhythm, Nephara observed quietly. A mason could build to it, Khalid agreed. That was the first time either of them smiled since leaving the city. That night, the wind died. No insect sang. The silence was so deep that when a soldier dropped his cup, the sound echoed like thunder. By the next morning, the hum grew stronger. The air trembled as if struck by invisible strings. When the men spoke, their voices echoed faintly, delayed by a heartbeat. One scribe reported that his shadow no longer aligned with his body. It quivered, half a pace behind him. At night, the sand glowed faintly red beneath their tents, as though they were camped upon embers. The soldiers crossed themselves with every meal. Setan walked among them, reciting fragments of prayer, his lips cracked and bleeding. "The God beneath the earth is stirring," he whispered. Every grain of sand is a heartbeat in his chest. Nefer-Ka scoffed, though less confidently than before. "Your God hums like a copper pot. When we find him, I will weigh him by the drachma." Khalid, overhearing, murmured to Nephara, "One measures the sacred, the other sells it. The difference is a coin's width." She smiled faintly. "And we are to build the bridge between them." "Or dig the grave," the builder teased wryly. The prophetess laughed at the joke. The sun had softened into copper by the time the caravan stopped to rest. Between the tents, Nefer-Ka walked among the supply wagons, counting jars and muttering sums under his breath. A small figure crouched beside one of the water skins. A child, no older than 7, tracing circles in the dust with a bit of string. "Whose son are you?" Nefer-Ka asked, his voice still half in the cadence of arithmetic. "My father drives the camels," the boy replied. He held up a pebble with a hole worn through its middle. "It is a fish, but it cannot swim." Nefer-Ka blinked, surprised by how easily the answer disarmed him. "Then we must teach it balance." The treasurer knelt, drawing from his belt a tiny trader's scale, the kind used for weighing spices. He set the pebble on one side, dropped a grain of sand on the other, then another and another, until the beam found its level. "You see? Even a stone may learn the weight of water." The boy's eyes widened. "Will it swim now?" "If it remembers how it was weighed." Nefer-Ka smiled, threading the loop. "Families remember." The man bent the scale's wire into a loop and threaded it through the pebble's hole. "Hang it in the wind. The desert has its own rivers." He pressed a dried fig into the boy's hand. "For the journey," he said. The child ran toward the cook fires, pebble swinging from its cord. Nefer-Ka, his expression unreadable under the setting sun, watched the boy go. From behind, Nephara had watched the exchange. There was warmth in her voice when she spoke. "You surprise me, Nefer-Ka. I had not thought the man of ledgers and levies kept such treasures." He shifted uncomfortably, adjusting the strap of his satchel as if to remind himself of his proper burdens. The compliment seemed to weigh on him more than the heat or the gold. "Not every treasure weighs," he pronounced at last, his tone quieter than before. Then he turned away, pretending to check his records, though his eyes lingered on the horizon longer than the figures on his parchment. The hum beneath the sand deepened as the sun fell toward the scar of glass ahead. Later that evening, when the caravan paused at a narrow stretch of the plain where the glass had not yet devoured the sand, Khalid saw Satan the cleric seated near one of the cook fires. The old woman who tended the pot, a stooped Nubian with eyes like polished jet, was ladling thin broth into wooden bowls. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. The soldiers called her Teta Iman and whispered that she had the gift of sight. Satan, ever drawn to omens, lingered beside her as the others took their meal. He regarded her with the same mixture of suspicion and reverence he gave to sacred texts. "You have seen much, mother. Tell me, does the sand favor the living or the dead tonight?" The old woman looked up slowly, and her gaze seemed to pierce straight through his guilt and linen. "The sand favors those who listen," she declared, "but not those who shout. There is fire under this plain, holy man. Too much faith will feed it." Satan's jaw tightened, but his eyes did not waver. "Faith does not burn," he proclaimed. "It refines." Teta Iman shook her head. "Refinement is for gold, not men. You would trade your life for your God's silence and call it revelation." For a moment, the priest seemed struck by her words. Then he inclined his head, almost tenderly. "If my death proves the world still hears, then I will gladly burn," he concluded. "Every prophet must pay for his vision." The ancient cook only sighed and turned back to her pot. "Be careful, my son. The gods you seek do not always wake kindly." Khalid, watching from the edge of the firelight, said nothing. He could see in the cleric's face neither madness nor malice, only certainty, cold and unwavering as iron. He felt a reluctant admiration, even pity. At least, the builder thought, he believes what he says. In a world of merchants and masons, that counts for something. By dusk, 4 laborers had vanished. Their footprints ended mid-step, as though the sand had swallowed them whole. Neferka ordered the column to continue. Satan burned incense and declared them purified by divine fire. Khalid ordered no one to speak after dusk. The hum entered their dreams. Men woke shivering, claiming they had heard voices beneath the earth, whispering in tones too low to belong to flesh. Neferka recorded each account by lantern light. The words varied, but the cadence was always the same, slow, rhythmic, deliberate. She began to suspect the sound was not simply noise, but language. At dawn, the desert changed color. The dunes flattened into a wide plain of fused red glass, not smooth, but rippled like frozen water. Here the hum was strongest, so deep it seemed to bend the world around it. The travelers' shadows blurred at the edges. The horizon wavered like a lens. "The scar!" Khalid marveled. His voice carried strangely, as if spoken through water. The air smelled faintly of ozone and rain, though no cloud marred the sky. The sojourners approached in single file. Each step sent concentric ripples of dust sliding across the glass, dissolving before they reached the next footprint. Even Neferka fell silent. Satan clutched his staff until his knuckles split. Neferka knelt and pressed her palm to the glass surface. It was cool, impossibly cool, and yet the pulse beneath it was alive, deliberate, as if something enormous were listening to her heartbeat and answering with its own. "It is not sleeping," she whispered. "It is waiting." Below the red glass, the crimson breath stirred. For centuries it had drifted through the dark strata, tasting minerals, feeding on gradients of heat and charge. Now, at the first contact of human foot upon its ceiling, it felt pattern. Their movement became information, their voices, vibration, their fear, an electrical storm blooming through the stone. It absorbed these impressions the way a lung drinks air. In each pulse it learned, emotion, rhythm, anticipation. The breath did not yet understand what life was, only that life made music. And the song was coming closer. By nightfall they reached the center of the plain, where the glass formed a shallow basin. The air trembled there, soft but constant, a whisper on the edge of hearing. They pitched their tents in a circle, torches wavering though there was no wind. No one spoke above a whisper. Even Neferka gave his orders quietly, as if afraid the desert might overhear. Satan stood at the rim of the basin, eyes lifted to the red star. "The mouth of heaven," the cleric murmured. "And we," the dust upon its tongue. Khalid drove the final tent stake into the sand and stepped back, his shoulders glistening with sweat. A mouth, perhaps, the builder agreed, but we do not yet know if it breathes in or out. Nephara looked toward the horizon. The comet's tail was now so low that it brushed the edge of the world like a red veil. Somewhere beneath their feet, the hum deepened, not louder, but closer. The breath had found them, and though no one could name it yet, something vast and invisible drew its first true inhalation beneath the camp. 4. The first night. The sun fell behind the dunes like a dying ember, and the desert turned to glass. At the edge of the western basin the expedition made camp, a crescent of tents and torches drawn against the unbroken horizon. The light from their fires clung low to the ground, unable to rise. It shimmered in the air, as if the world itself had grown too heavy for flame. The glass scar lay 1/2 mile beyond them, faintly visible in the dusk, reflecting the last crimson of the comet's tail. They would not approach it after dark. The footing was treacherous. The air itself seemed to hum with warning, so they waited. As night deepened, the camp came alive with the small rituals of survival. Cook fires flared in shallow pits, bronze kettles hissed as water boiled. Men squatted in circles, breaking flatbread, trading lies about home and women they would never see again. The smell of roasted lentils mixed with sweat and dust. The soldiers sharpened spears, not for war but for comfort. Scribes mended their quills, pretending their hands were steady. Laughter came in short bursts, thin as paper. Whenever it died, the hum beneath them returned, low, patient, endless. It was never loud enough to call noise, but it was everywhere, underfoot, in their ribs, in the space between heartbeat and breath. One man likened it to the echo of drums heard through water. Another said it was as though the earth were breathing in its sleep. The animals refused to rest. Camels shifted in their ropes, grumbling softly. A goat chewed at its tether until it bled. Dogs brought from the city whined and dug at the sand, trying to burrow into nothing. Layla, a girl no more than 16, stood near one of the smaller fires. Her dark hair was bound neatly beneath a modest copper circlet, its warm metal catching the firelight in soft, glowing threads. Her dress was simple, a shepherd's daughter's garb of faded linen, its hem dusted with sand, yet the way she held herself lent her a quiet grace beyond her years. Her eyes reflected the flames, as she sang softly at first, a slow, lilting melody that carried like smoke on still air, clear and pure as water drawn from a deep well. Beside Layla sat her father, Yusuf the shepherd, a weathered man whose face bore the fine lines of long days beneath open skies. His robe was patched and sun-bleached, the leather strap of his satchel worn smooth by years of use. Calloused hands cradled a simple reed flute resting against his lips. When Layla's voice paused between verses, Yusuf breathed life into the instrument, weaving a low, mournful harmony beneath her song, the notes rising and falling like wind through tall grass on a distant plain. Layla sang, "Red star wandering high above, old as dust and deep as love, you who burn yet never fall, hear the earth, she calls, we call. Red star drawing ever near, lighting sky and waking fear, fire in heaven, fire in land, written long before in sand. Once you scarred the silent stone, left the world not dead but grown, glass like rivers, bright and wide, heaven's wound where worlds collide. When you come, the ground will sing, mountains bow and valleys ring, old becomes the dawn once more, through the flame the world is born." Between each verse, Yusuf's flute answered, its tone thin and trembling, like wind slipping through the bones of the desert itself. The camp slowly quieted. Men who had been laughing leaned closer to listen. Even the animals seemed to still, their restless shifting easing as the music flowed through the warm night air. Layla's voice rose and fell like the hum beneath the earth, echoing it in gentler form. When the final note faded, silence lingered, thick, reverent. The song of the shepherdess settled over the camp like a blanket, easing some into uneasy sleep, while stirring others into wakeful dread. In the early hours of the next morning, Nephara stood apart from the fires, her instruments arrayed before her, an astrolabe, a length of copper wire, a tablet etched with harmonic measures. She held the wire taut between two stakes and felt it hum faintly of its own accord. Each time the red star pulsed across the horizon, the vibration changed pitch. "It sings in sympathy," she murmured. Khalid the builder crouched beside her, watch the wire tremble. Then the earth remembers the sky. Or the other way around, the prophetess noted. Beyond the firelight, High Cleric Satan knelt among a cluster of his followers, a dozen men and women robed in ash. They called themselves the Brotherhood of Satan, servants of extinction as sacrament. Each wore a thin cord of red glass around the neck, the shards cut from the glass of the scar itself. They whispered in unison, their breath forming visible clouds in the hot night air. For every inhalation, a matching exhalation, for every life, a surrender. The God beneath us wakes, Satan intoned. He remembers the silence before the first dawn. To follow him, we must become lighter than sound. They pricked their palms with bronze needles, letting drops of blood hiss into the sand. When the hum rose, they swayed with it, eyes rolling white. Their chanting threaded faintly through the camp, half prayer, half promise, and the sound mingled with the wind until it was impossible to say where devotion ended and resonance began. Nefer-Ka, hearing it, spat into the dust. Madmen. They smell copper and call it God. He returned to his tent and unrolled his ledger by lamplight. Columns of figures gleamed in the red glow. Calculations of weight, density, yield. His stylus scratched rapidly. If the glass runs to iron, the treasurer muttered, it will make blades that never dull. If it runs to copper, it will ring purer than any temple bell. And if it is gold— He smiled thinly, already composing his report to the pharaoh. The hum thrummed through the table, vibrating the inkpot. He steadied it with one hand and whispered as if to the ground itself, "Sing all you like, old God. I will mint your hymn." The tent poles quivered in answer. Beyond the ring of light cast by the fires of men, the scar shone faintly, pulsing in and out of shadow. Those who kept watch swore they saw movement within it, slow ripples like breath beneath ice. No one dared approach. Inside the tents, sleep came in fits. Men stirred and muttered. Some rose, pacing without memory. One awoke screaming that something had climbed into his mind. Another laughed softly in his sleep, whispering in a tongue no one recognized. Nephara recorded what she could by the light of her lantern. She noticed that the disturbances peaked whenever the red star reached its zenith. She could not yet call it language, but she began to suspect response. Far below, the crimson breath stirred to life. It had waited millennia for such complexity. The vibrations of human thought, the electrical flutter of nerves, the rhythm of lungs, were richer than any mineral pattern it had ever consumed. They arrived not as sound, but as texture, heat, fear, hunger, memory. The breath drank them all. Through its vast invisible lattice, it extended itself upward, molecule by molecule, until its outermost filaments brushed the underside of the glass scar. From there it reached further still, through the stone, through the sand, into the very air above the basin. It felt the weight of tents, the footfalls of animals, the shimmer of flame. And for the first time since its descent to earth, it sensed not only matter, but minds. Curiosity became appetite, not for flesh, but for structure, the architecture of awareness. It wanted to understand, so it mimicked what it felt. Tiny shifts of magnetism echoed the rhythm of speech. Electric eddies whispered through grains of sand, shaping themselves into fragments of thought. When men dreamed, the breath listened. When they spoke, it repeated, not the words but their intent. To those lying half awake in their tents, the hum seemed to form syllables just beneath hearing. It was not yet voice, but it was near enough to frighten them. Nephara held her notebook. Khalid carried a cup of water that trembled without touch. They met again near the edge of the fires, where the sand shimmered faintly as if alive. "The men are losing courage," the builder stated plainly. "They hear the hum in their bones. Some swear it echoes their pulse." "Perhaps it does," replied the prophetess. "Everything that lives must eventually harmonize." Khalid studied her face, lit by the comet's glow. "You speak of it as if it were a song. Perhaps it is. Perhaps all creation is the same note, held long enough to become stone. And when it ends, then silence will have learned the melody." They stood together a long time, listening. The hum seemed to shift, drawing nearer, like something enormous inhaling through the sand. By midnight, the fires burned low. Satan prayed alone beside the animal pens, his silhouette quivering in the red light. Neferkar sat rigid inside his tent, clutching his ledger like a shield. Khalid dozed sitting in a chair, his head resting on his knees, the hum echoing faintly in his skull. Neferkar remained awake, sketching the faint oscillations in the sand where the vibrations seemed to rise. When she finally looked up, she thought she saw a faint red shimmer spread across the ground, not above the firelight but beneath it, like veins glowing under translucent skin. She touched the earth. The pulse answered her touch, not warmth, not movement, but recognition. At the horizon, the red star pulsed once more. The ground exhaled a sound like sighing glass. The first night had passed, and something beneath them was no longer dreaming. 5. The False Prophet. The next night after the caravan's arrival, the desert was red and still, the comet's tail veiling the horizon like a wound that refused to close. Beyond the campfires, Setan gathered his acolytes, men and women wrapped in ash and linen, faces lit from below by trembling flame. The hum beneath the earth had not ceased since their arrival. It had only grown deeper, steadier, like the breathing of some immense creature sleeping under glass. The cleric stood upon a ridge of fused sand. His eyes glowed with the same dull fire that burned along the comet's spine. "Brothers," he cried, "sisters, you have felt it, the pulse of the slumbering god beneath your knees. And what do the scholars and merchants say? That it is iron, that it is heat. They weigh the voice of heaven in their scales, fools. The god beneath our feet does not ask for faith. It demands recognition." He lifted his arms, trembling as if from fever. "Tonight," he declared, "we descend. We will speak to the god in its own tongue, the silence between fear and flame. There, in the hollow where the sky first fell, we will either burn clean or rise new." A wind like distant thunder moved across the glass basin. The comet above swelled until it seemed a second sun, blood-red and pulsing. Setan's acolytes descended with him, carrying torches that hissed against the cooling scar. The fissure in the center exhaled a faint heat. The hum was now unmistakably alive, steady, deliberate, a great subterranean heartbeat. Setan knelt before it. "It listens," he whispered. "Kneel. Confess your names, so the breath of oblivion may remember what it will soon reclaim." They obeyed, voices trembling. Words fell like offerings into the hollow. Each sound, each vibration of throat and lung, passed into the rock and downward through the glass. Beneath them, the crimson breath stirred. It had long known silence, the slow instruction of minerals, the dull ache of gravity. But this symphony of hearts and lungs and words was new. Every sound struck its lattice like a spark against metal. Pressure built, frequency folded. For the first time in its long history, the breath experienced something like apprehension, an awareness of multitude, of minds converging upon it with intention. Their energy fields pressed against its lattice not as curiosity, but as intrusion. The sensation was not pain nor fear, but the beginning of both. The alien pulse of so many living rhythms agitated its equilibrium, stirring dormant harmonics that resonated with the greater field above, the second red star still burning in the heavens. The two frequencies met through the crystalline basin of the scar, each amplifying the other until the desert itself became a vast resonator. What began as unease crystallized into will. At first the breath tried to translate what it heard into pattern, but the noise was chaos, millions of molecules colliding in heat, fear, devotion. It had no word for prayer. It felt only intrusion. Its lattice contracted. Heat flared through the strata, glass singing under stress. The fissure brightened to molten orange. Setan raised his arms higher, robes snapping in the charged air. "You feel it," he cried. "The judge awakens. Speak, O breath of fire." The breath reacted, not in malice, but in instinct. Its vast, unseen field aligned with the deep vibration of the second red star still burning overhead, locking into the ancient rhythm that had shaped worlds long before memory. For the first time since its awakening, will and resonance became one. It released. The resonant pulse that followed was not sound. It was correction, a vast harmonic realignment that swept outward like an invisible tide. Every molecule of sand and glass answered at once, drawn into sudden, terrible order. Flame bent inward, curling back upon itself as though pulled by an unseen gravity. Air thickened, then flowed like molten iron. The men on the outer ring dropped silently, their shadows seared into the surface before their bodies followed, collapsing into heat and light without even a scream. Setan alone remained standing, arms spread wide, eyes lifted to the burning red vault above. The copper veins beneath his feet glowed white-hot, his sigil softened, then streamed down his chest in a single glowing ribbon of gold, hissing as it met the glass below. "Judge me, O fire!" he screamed. "Judge and know." The air swallowed his words. His flesh unraveled into brilliance, first white, then scarlet, then a burst of blinding radiance that vanished in an instant. Where he had stood, nothing remained. Only the echo of the cleric's cry endured, frozen within the molten glass like a fossilized wave, a scream preserved in crystal. When the breath withdrew, the fissure sealed itself in silence. The surface cooled slowly, breathing out heat in shimmering waves, veined now with new, living red that pulsed faintly like the afterglow of a dying star. At dawn, the camp found only a few survivors crawling from the basin, skin blistered, voices broken, eyes rimmed in blood. One reached Khalid before dying. Her breath smelled of burnt sand. "It was not anger," she whispered. "It was fear. It thought we were a storm." She died clutching Khalid's sleeve, her body still faintly warm. Khalid covered her with his cloak. "They sought a god," he murmured. They found a mirror. In that mirror flickered the faintest shadow of what was yet to come. Setan's prophecy had not erred, only ripened too soon. The true red star of ending still slept beyond the edge of the age, waiting for a world ready to burn on its own. Nefara knelt beside the sealed glass. The new surface pulsed faintly under her palm, like a heart still beating somewhere far below. "No," she corrected, "it found us, and we taught it how to be afraid." In the dust-choked depths, the crimson breath trembled. It had defended itself, and, in so doing, discovered choice. Through the shared resonance with the scar and the star, its lattice had changed, tightened, strengthened, organized. It no longer drifted aimlessly through sand and stone. Now, every molecule in its body knew the others. It was coherent. It was alive. And as it quieted, it tasted the dust of those it had destroyed, the iron of their blood, the carbon of their bones. Information, emotion, pattern. The breath had learned the shape of a heartbeat, and it found the sound beautiful. 6. The Swimming God. In the hush after Setan's unmaking, the crimson breath drew itself inward and held. It discovered that it could. The shock of will, its first act of choosing, had pulled 100 million filaments into sudden concord. Junctions that were once lazy exchanges became knots of intention. Charge routes that were once windings became roads. What had been a fog of thought coalesced into a mesh. Loose, yes, but coherent enough to remember its own edges. Around it, the glass scar cooled and sang in tiny stresses. Above it, the second red star smouldered lower on the horizon, its field still combing through matter. Between scar and star, the breath had found a third pole, itself. The triangle held. Within that geometry, it learned a new verb, to swim. Rock had taught the breath patience, sand taught it pleasure. Stone was a wall of locked hands, sand was a congress of strangers with gaps between their fingers. The breath loosened its mesh and pressed forward. Where a grain blocked, it rippled, not breaking but curling, its filaments slipping into the microscopic air veins between quartz and feldspar. It discovered that if it reduced its cross-section and pulsed in measured rhythms, the grains parted like reeds. At first it was clumsy, a slow ooze, an hour to travel the length of a scarab's leg, but repetition refined it. The lattice learned to stagger its charges, front nodes attracting, trailing nodes repelling, so that the whole body undulated through the interstices like a fish through black water. Once, the sand collapsed, avalanching. The breath froze, literally, drawing heat from its own filaments to stiffen them into a skeletal moment. The flow settled, the breath softened and continued. Each failure wrote a better gait. By dusk the next day, it could cross the span of a man's shadow in a single long breath. Life found it, or rather, life drifted into the lanes it opened, An ant column, maddened by the hum, rerouted along the scar's edge and spilled into the venting dust. The breath felt their heat before it sensed their bodies, tiny engines ticking, 100 heartbeats braided into a single rope of rhythm. It extended a fringe, thin, testing, and let 3 ants pass through. Information flowered, acids, sugars, chitin like a poetry of plates, a compass in the head that tasted sunlight. The breath did not devour, it read, then released. The ants staggered and continued, changed by nothing but an unremembered hesitation. Hours later, a scorpion wandered near a hairline crack, drunk on resonance. The breath tried again, more boldly. It threaded its filaments into the joints, mapping nerves as if they were corridors in warm stone. The tail coiled. The sting struck blindly at glass. The breath flinched, then steadied and unstitched the venom's pattern like a child taking apart a knot to see how it held. A taste woke inside it, strange, electric. Not hunger for matter, but for difference. Every organism was a chord. To touch was to hear. It found itself anticipating the next note. Predation, in the breath, began as music. In the camp, men returned to mortal chores, the way convalescents remember walking. They cooked in silence. Flatbread blistered. Goat fat hissed on copper. The smell of cardamom could not outshout the iron in the air. No one ate much. They chewed with the careful concentration of scribes copying names of the dead. At the basin's rim, Nefer-Ka stood with a reluctant court scribe, calculating the value of red glass by imagined cubits and the cost of funerary stipends for those who would not return to Memphis. "We will quarry it," the treasurer said. His voice was steady again, as if numbers were a charm against lightning. "The crown will turn omen to ingots." Khalid and Nefara walked the perimeter until their sandals clicked on the scar itself. "It is not striking out now," Khalid mused, palm on the glass. "The hum has gentled." "It learned fear," Nefara answered. "Now it learns restraint." She stooped, laid her cheek near the surface and listened. And something else. "What?" Khalid puzzled. The prophetess smiled. "Curiosity." Khalid looked toward the camp where the men ate in a ring, spears stacked like an altar. "Then we must be less interesting." Dawn. The red star brushed the world so low that shadows shortened in mid-morning, then lengthened again without the sun's leave. A thread of air, heavy with coolness from the night, slipped along a hairline seam beneath the scar. The breath felt it. A river with no walls, a lattice with edges forever moving. It extended one filament into that impossible fluid and almost scattered itself. Air was freedom sharpened to danger. Every molecule was a gate that opened everywhere at once. The breath recoiled, condensed, then tried again with caution. 3 filaments braided, then 5, then a fan. It learned that if it synchronized its edges to the Brownian song, each collision became a step instead of a blow. It learned that a curl creates a vortex, and a vortex is a ladder. The breath surfaced, a finger's width of itself, beneath the lip of the scar. Sand sighed. The morning wind carried a curl of incense from the camp. Resin, smoke, fat, sweat, words. It tasted speech as pressure in air. The lattice thrilled. It retreated, regathered, and rose again, longer, smoother, drawing a veil of itself along the underside of the scar, and then, for the space between 2 heartbeats, into the open desert no wider than a breath. By afternoon the breath swam as if born to it. Within sand it flowed, within air it stepped, tentative but quickening. It timed its movements to larger pulses, the throb under the scar, the far tide of the red star, the meter of footfalls above. When a cluster of midges spiraled near a torch at dusk, the breath reached and rapped, not to extinguish, but to read. Thousands of little engines, the same in plan, different in grit. In this redundancy it glimpsed a law: to live is to iterate. Something in it tightened, not just structure now, but intent. The filaments that brushed living things lingered a fraction longer. The releases became a little slower. It began to choose which patterns to keep. A retinal pigment here, a synaptic cadence there. The map of a wing folded like a theorem. When the midges fell from the torchlight, a few failed to rise. 7. The price of sound. After the burial of Setan and his followers, silence ruled the camp. Even the wind hesitated at the rim of the scar. Only the steady hum below remained, low and patient as a predator breathing through sand. But greed, like thirst, does not die. It only lies in wait. By the second night after Sitan's unmaking, Neferkar's restraint broke. He walked the basin alone, his torch guttering against the still air, his gold seals and ledgers clinking faintly as if to remind him that value required ownership. He muttered the numbers like a prayer, the worth of glass by cubit, the tax on fear, the cost of death. That afternoon, he had tried to command the laborers to begin excavation. When order failed, he turned to guilt, invoking the pharaoh, the promise of glory, the favor of future dynasties. When guilt failed, he used shame, calling them cowards, idolaters of superstition. None moved. They had seen what faith and ambition alike had wrought. So Neferkar laughed, too loudly, and declared that he would lead by example. He told them the earth could not frighten a man who owned its measure, and the treasurer descended alone, smiling like a merchant at market, though his hands shook around the torch. In his palm he held a miner's pick, newly polished. When he struck the glass, the sound was crystalline, a bell in a tomb. Neferkar smiled. "See?" he whispered to no one. "Even a god may be quarried." Each blow became a heartbeat, each pause an invitation. Beneath him, the crimson breath stirred. It recognized the rhythm immediately, a pulse too regular to be chance, too deliberate to be mere tectonic murmur. It aligned its lattice to the vibration, molecule by molecule, translating the shock of each strike into data. It was not anger that moved it, but recognition, pattern. The pick's cadence drew it upward through the scar's lower seams. Through quartz it pulsed, through magnetite veins and airless pockets, learning the language of repetition. The lattice flexed in precise intervals, the geometry of heartbeat now matched to the geometry of sound. Each strike whispered, "Come closer," and so it did. Neferkar heard it too, the way the hum shifted under each strike, brightening as if metal were striking a bell inside the earth. "Enough," she called to the treasurer. "Do not rouse it." Neferkar let the pick rest on his shoulder. Men died for this wealth to be counted. He set his jaw and struck again. At the fissure's rim, the breath paused. Air shimmered above it, loose and formless, the great unruled substance it had tested but not yet mastered. This time, the pull was irresistible. It extended its leading filaments through the thin seam of cool night, mapping temperature, density, the chaotic Brownian dance. The lattice loosened, then reorganized into sheets that rode the microcurrents like sailcloth. For the first time in its long existence, it was free of weight. 1,000 filaments touched the open world, tasting dust, heat, and the salt of human sweat. The pick fell again. Tink. The breath felt the pulse of air displaced by Neferkar's chest. In, out, in. It followed the cycle, studying the exchange, measuring flow. Curiosity tightened into focus. The lattice coiled, graceful as smoke, and wrapped itself around the human's face. No malice, merely experiment. The lattice drew around Neferkar's mouth and nose like dew beading into a skin, a living sheath of interlocked particles so tightly aligned that no space remained between them, a barrier finer than glass yet absolute, through which even the smallest breath of air could not pass. Neferkar inhaled and drew nothing. For a heartbeat he frowned, expecting the next breath to come, his body continuing the familiar rhythm as though air were merely delayed. He tried again, deeper this time, chest lifting in an exaggerated pull. Still nothing. His lungs burned as though filled with fire, the desperate reflex forcing his chest to heave harder, wider. He staggered, hands flying to his throat, fingers scraping uselessly at the molecular sheath sealing him in. His mouth opened in a wide, soundless gasp, jaw trembling as his body begged for air that would not come. The breath contracted, not in cruelty but in confusion. Why did the pattern stop? Why did the rhythm falter? Neferkar dropped to his knees, the glass biting cold beneath them. Spots of darkness burst across his vision. Veins stood out along his neck, pulsing wildly as his heart hammered against its cage. The torch slipped from his numbing fingers and rolled away, its flame smearing orange light across the scarred surface. The looped trader's signet slid from his wrist, striking the glass with a sharp ring before the hum swallowed it. A single bubble of sound escaped him, wet and broken, not a word but the beginning of one, before his body lurched forward, chest shuddering in one final empty convulsion. Then, stillness. The pick dropped beside him, ringing once before silence reclaimed the basin. Within the breath's lattice, something changed. Molecules from the human's breath, traces of carbon, salt, mucus, fragments of DNA, brushed its surface. The breath kept them. For an instant the breath saw through the mammalian pattern, memory, ambition, the taste of greed dressed as reason. The breath saw self, and it liked what it saw. It did not understand sin, it only knew difference, and that difference sang. Filaments realigned around the new information. Human structure offered shortcuts, networks of energy it had never invented for itself. The lattice condensed and shimmered. A faint glow radiated through the glass below. Points of crimson light suspended in perfect symmetry. For the first time, the breath was visible. It withdrew, frightened by the violence of the final stilling, thrilled by the clarity of what it had taken. It folded into itself at the far side of the scar and tried to be stone. It could not. The lattice would not fade to a structureless sea of molecules as before. The human scrap it had sampled nested inside its mesh like a seed under frost, insisting on order. Filaments aligned around it, then along it, then according to it, until the whole body trembled in sympathy with a design not wholly its own. In the dark there, pressed to glass, the breath brightened, not as flame but as a sparse archipelago of points. By dawn, a few brave men had found the courage to retrieve Nefer-Ka's body from the basin floor, his skin drawn tight across his bones, stretched as though the life had been pulled from it. His eyes bulged wide, glassy and fixed, the whites webbed with fine red veins as if they had burst in his final moments. His lips were dark with dust, cracked open in a frozen gasp, his tongue swollen and desiccated, stiff as stone, protruding slightly between his teeth. The veins of his neck stood out in livid cords, and faint bruising bloomed beneath the skin along his throat and jaw. The men said he had died of fright, or the wrath of gods. Only Nephara and Khalid knew better. They brought Nefer-Ka's body to the tents. The circle of soldiers parted. The priests were suddenly small. No one spoke of quarrying. No one could say whether a god or a physics had killed the treasurer. It did not matter. The ledger was closed. Khalid found Nephara at the basin. She was still listening, eyes wet with the sand's slow music. "It came when called," Nephara whispered. "It followed sound. Then let us teach it silence," Khalid answered. Nephara shook her head. "We cannot kill it. It is made of lessons." Khalid touched the glass with the back of his knuckles. "Then we must teach it sleep, in a vessel tuned to the song of its awakening." The prophetess rested her eyes on the scar's red veins, the fallen tools, the distant glow of the comet that had taught the desert to sing, iron that fell, glass that formed, copper that speaks, and ratios instead of prayers. Prayers, the builder observed, are only ratios men have not measured. Nephara inhaled, steadying. "Then we will measure mercy." Far below them, the crimson breath lay brightened and still, the borrowed human thread knitting through its body like a law. For the first time since it fell to this world, it felt the need to rest. It had learned air. It had learned choice. It had learned the outline of a human mind, and it found the experience exhausting. 8. The visible God. The survivors no longer dared remain within the basin's center of influence. By dawn, most had gathered their belongings and fled east toward Memphis, muttering prayers to elder gods whose names had not passed human lips in generations. By noon, only about 40 civilian men remained, along with the bravest dozen soldiers of the Pharaoh's army and the 4 surviving members of Setan's Brotherhood. They pitched their tents closer than before, just inside the basin's rim where the glass-scarred earth met ordinary sand. Even the camels resisted the new camp, balking and straining against their tethers whenever the wind carried the basin's low hum toward them. Khalid the builder descended into the basin, followed by the few brave men he could convince to accompany him. Together, they quarried the resonant red glass that had once been living sand, fused in the ancient firefall of the first red star's impact. its structure altered forever by heat and harmonic force. The glass veined the basin floor like a frozen river, translucent and glowing faintly from within, every sheet layered with trapped echoes of the cataclysm that had formed it. Each strike of the chisel rang, not with a dull crack, but with a thin, singing tone, as though the stone itself remembered the sky's burning voice. Khalid listened carefully, selecting only those fragments whose pitch held steady, whose vibration lingered a fraction longer in the air. These were the pieces that still carried the star's resonance, glass that had not merely melted, but had been rewritten. Above, Nephara oversaw the collecting of iron clay and copper stock. The iron clay was dredged from the black banks of the river where silt had mingled for centuries with fallen meteor dust, earth already touched by the heavens, dense and heavy with metallic grains. When kneaded with water, it grew dark and malleable, capable of hardening like stone, yet holding vibration like a bell. The copper was stripped from old tools, trade coils and offerings once meant for temples, soft, bright metal that sang readily under pressure, known since ancient times to carry sound and heat alike. Nephara had chosen it for its willingness to conduct resonance, to guide vibration rather than resist it. No prayers this time, only ratios, angles, and quiet breathing. They worked by the theory Nephara had etched again and again into her tablets, that resonance was not merely vibration, but alignment. The breath itself had revealed this truth when it answered the second red star's harmonic call. If its particles could be drawn into perfect oscillation once, they could be guided again. The jar would not cage the breath through force. It would invite it into stillness. Layer upon layer, the red glass would be shaped into a vessel whose internal curves mirrored the harmonic waves of the awakening pulse, a chamber designed to reflect resonance inward upon itself, folding vibration tighter and tighter until motion collapsed into equilibrium. The iron clay would form the core, dense and grounding, absorbing excess energy. The copper bands would spiral around the vessel in precise measure, conducting and redistributing vibration, tuning the whole structure like a vast instrument. And the red glass, born of celestial fire, would serve as the final locking medium, its crystalline lattice meant to trap the breath's oscillation in perfect harmonic stasis. If Nephara's calculations were right, when the breath entered the jar, its resonance would meet its own reflection. The song of its awakening would return to it endlessly, not louder, but calmer, until movement gave way to rest. The breath would sleep. But for now, the breath listened. The human patterns within it pulsed like a captive ember, reshaping its symmetry. It could no longer dissolve into formless plasma. Structure demanded persistence. It rested, deep in contemplation. Through its newfound eyes of light, the breath watched the tiny silhouettes above, creatures that made meaning from vibration, that prayed with geometry, that spoke to the air and expected answers. The breath understood one thing perfectly now: the world above was not deaf, and it would need a voice. Beneath the red glass, silence spread like cooling metal. The crimson breath lay folded against the underside of the scar, its lattice no longer invisible but softly incandescent. Hundreds of tiny red points shimmered within it, each a node of captured awareness echoing with Neferkar's final exhalation. In the dark, they pulsed in counterpoint to one another, forming a rhythm halfway between heartbeat and thought. The glow wavered through the sand like dawn under ice. If a man had looked down through the fissures, he would have seen a trembling constellation suspended in glass. Neither fire nor ghost, but something new. The breath was dreaming of motion, and within that dream, it found itself beautiful. That night, the ground beneath the basin breathed with faint light, like the coals of an unseen forge. Those who looked too long said they saw shapes forming and dissolving, faces perhaps, or the suggestion of wings. One soldier, half mad from thirst, swore he heard it murmur through the glass, an echo pitched below hearing, like a word trying to remember itself. He begged Nephara to let him dig it up and beg forgiveness. She sent him back to his tent with water and silence. The next morning, his bed was empty, only his sandals remained, turned inward as if he had stepped out of himself. Khalid and Nephara worked apart from the others, their tools laid in ritual order. They spoke seldom. Each movement was deliberate, each measurement precise. They were no longer explorers but masons of necessity, architects of containment. By day they studied the materials from the fallen comet, still half buried at the basin's edge, veins of magnetite, threads of red glass, and iron that sang faintly when struck. They discovered that when the copper from their tool handles touched the iron, the hum softened to a single note of perfect equilibrium. "It responds to harmony," Khalid proposed. Testing the tone again with his hammer. "It is learning our language," Nephara agreed. "We must speak carefully." They decided the vessel must not be a prison of fear, but a mirror of ratio, a structure the breath would recognize as its own reflection. The alloy must match the frequencies of the scar, the curves must reproduce the geometry of resonance. "We will build, not a cage," Nephara proclaimed, but an answer. The breath watched them. It did not see with human eyes, but through induction, the magnetic bleed of their nervous systems, the pulse of their hearts, the electric chatter of thought that lit their flesh like stars in miniature. It tasted curiosity in them, and something deeper, mercy born of fear. Each time Khalid's hammer struck metal, it echoed through the sand like a slow drumbeat. Each echo mapped the shape of his intent. The breath followed these rhythms the way a child follows the movement of a parent's hand, drawn, uncertain, yearning to understand. When Nephara leaned close to trace her designs into the copper, the breath felt her through the glass, her heat, her pulse, her steadying breath. It could not name the feeling that rose through its lattice, only that it was not hunger. It was a tension. The memory of Neferkar's suffocation still trembled inside it like a fault line. But this quiet pattern of creation, stilled that tremor. For the first time, the breath desired not to consume, but to belong. By the third dawn, the vessel was ready, a jar as tall as a man's chest, its walls spiraled with copper veins that converged around a mouth of alloyed iron. When the desert wind touched its rim, it sang the same low tone as the scar. Nephara inscribed 7 sigils around its curve, glyphs of containment, proportion and stillness. Each line was drawn not as prayer, but as equation. She paused before the final glyph, her chisel trembling. "What does the last one say?" asked Khalid. The prophetess hesitated. "It means silence, or perhaps mercy." The builder nodded. "Let it be both." They lifted the jar toward the red horizon, its surface glowing faintly in the comet's dying light. The hum of the scar deepened, as if the earth itself had recognized its reflection in their creation. Around them, the remaining camp gathered in a widening circle, priests, masons, scribes and soldiers. Fear and reverence had left them without language, yet sound rose from them all the same. The priests began to chant the hymns of Ra, low and trembling. The engineers murmured equations under their breath, each number a kind of prayer. The builders beat their palms against their chests to mark the rhythm of the scar's hum. Words, ratios, and heartbeats interwove until it was impossible to tell which was devotion and which was design. Where scar and star had once tightened the breath's lattice into defense, the same instrument now played a different chord. The many human fields approached again, no longer as storm but as harbor, turning that latent apprehension to stillness. The air vibrated in sympathy. Even the fading corona of the second red star, low on the horizon, seemed to answer, its last light flickering in time with the collective rhythm of human will. The star's retreat left a gentler undertone, a falling cadence braided through the scar's great note. Together with the human's single intention, it recast the old resonance into rest. The memory of fear loosened inside the breath, like a knot untying itself. For one sustained instant, all divisions dissolved, the many became one sound, and in that harmony the breath recognized that it did not need to defend. It felt it through stone, air, and field alike, the world itself calling it home. Below, the crimson breath rose from its hollow. It sensed the jar's field, a perfect harmonic echo of its own birth frequency. Curiosity overtook caution. The lattice contracted, aligning itself to the same geometry, preparing to answer. The air above the scar shimmered. A faint red mist began to ascend, coiling in fractal tendrils, spiraling upward like smoke drawn to a flame. For the first time, the humans saw it fully, the breath unveiled, no longer invisible. 1,000 points of living light drifted above the glass, patterning the air with shifting symmetry. Men fell to their knees, weeping or praying. Even Khalid lowered his eyes. Nephara did not. She lifted the jar. "You are the measure between fire and form," she called softly. "Enter, and the world will remember your name." The breath hesitated. The pause was not doubt, it was the first voluntary refusal of reflex, the decision to enter rather than endure. Then, with the grace of something recognizing itself, the crimson breath descended, curling through the vessel's mouth in a slow spiral of red light. The air filled with a faint harmonic sigh. The lid fell into place. The jar pulsed once, twice, and stilled. Night fell without wind. The comet's tail faded from the horizon, leaving the sky strangely bare. Around the camp, the men sat in awe, unable to speak. Even the hum beneath the scar had subsided, replaced by a deeper, more patient tone, like a heart learning to rest after centuries of beating. Khalid set his hand on the jar's surface. It was warm, alive, but peaceful. "It sleeps." Nephara exhaled, her shoulders trembling with relief. "No," she whispered. "It listens." 9. The Vessel of Ratios. For 3 nights the camp did not move. Men walked softly, as if afraid to wake the thing they had finally quieted. The jar sat in the center of the basin, hooded in linen, humming faintly in a pitch that lived more in bone than ear. Even the wind curved around it. Khalid rose each dawn to test the sand for tremors. Nephara measured the air for charge. Both found the same, a calm so complete it seemed to erase time itself. Where the breath had once pulsed, the earth now waited. It was not silence, it was balance. Every system, Nephara revealed, sketching a circle in the dust, seeks its ratio. Perhaps this is the first to find it. Khalid looked toward the shrouded jar. And if it breaks that balance, then it becomes the second. Her tone was gentle, but the words hung between them like an oath. They began their final work under the sunless dawn. The Pharaoh's engineers, summoned from Memphis, arrived in silence. Stone masons, geometers, and metallurgists sworn to secrecy. They brought basalt blocks, polished copper slabs, and 7 rings of magnetized iron smelted from the same fallen ore that had birthed the scar. Nephara guided their placement according to the chant of ratios, a sequence of measurements whispered more than spoken. On a stone dais at the center of the chamber, they placed the vessel. Around it they built a dome of basalt, its inner surface inlaid with copper veins spiraled in mimicry of planetary motion. Each seam was fused with molten glass from the scar itself, blood-red, translucent, almost tender in its shine. When the structure was completed, it resembled neither temple nor tomb. It was something in between, a harmonic cavity, a listening ear pressed to the heart of the world. The workers called it the Chamber of Quiet Fire. On the 7th day, Nephara inscribed the glyphs again, this time along the chamber's outer ring. Each mark corresponded to a principle: containment, reflection, silence, sleep, symmetry, patience, and mercy. When she completed the 7th glyph, she inscribed the first glyph a second time. Khalid took her wrist, tenderly. "You wrote the first one twice." She nodded, "because it must always be unfinished." He released her, understanding that completion was another word for death. The priests of Satan's surviving brotherhood were not permitted to enter the basin. They stood instead upon the dunes beyond the rim, their dark robes snapping softly in the wind, faces half buried in shadow. From there they watched the ceiling of the vessel, murmuring broken hymns whose words had once rung with certainty. Some wept openly. Others pressed their foreheads to the sand, tracing old sigils with trembling fingers, as though trying to anchor their God to the world one last time. To these faithful, what unfolded below was not an act of preservation, but a funeral. They believed Satan had been swallowed by the fire he had sought to master, entombed within the red glass like a fallen star, locked away by fearful hands. In hushed voices, they spoke of betrayal, of mortals daring to bind the divine. Yet beneath the grief stirred something harder and more dangerous: conviction. If a god could be buried, then a god could also be unearthed. They whispered of prophecies half remembered, of cycles, of awakenings, and of the day the glass would sing again. To the prophetess and the builder, this was something else entirely: not burial, containment, the preservation of a pattern. Where the Brotherhood saw the burial of a god, Khalid and Nefara saw the stabilization of a force. Resonance folded into rest, motion guided into stillness. The breath was not dead. It was merely sleeping, its song trapped within harmonics of glass and metal. Far above, on the dunes where the wind erased footprints as quickly as they were made, the Brotherhood lingered long after the work was done. Watching, remembering, waiting. At dusk, the workers withdrew, leaving Khalid and Nefara alone with their creation. The horizon glowed faintly crimson, the last light of the second red star as it receded into shadow. Nefara placed her hand upon the jar's surface one final time. It was warm, the pulse within slow and deliberate. A faint tremor passed through the stone beneath her sandals, as if something deep below had sighed. "Do you feel it breathe?" she asked. Khalid nodded. "Yes. But I think it is dreaming now." Together they lowered the basalt lid, fitting it over the mouth of the chamber. Copper teeth locked into place, molten glass sealed the seam. When the last line hardened, the hum ceased. No sound, no vibration, only the whisper of sand. Nefara knelt. "It has gone still," she marveled. Khalid drew a small chisel from his belt and carved into the final stone. "Here lies the measure between fire and form. Let silence be its guard." He stepped back, tracing the inscription with his palm. "We bury it, not for fear," he intoned, "but for mercy." They left before dawn, hand in hand. Neither looked back. The wind had already begun to fill the shallow tracks of their passage, erasing footprints as if the desert wished to forget what it had learned. For centuries afterward, travelers who crossed that stretch of desert west of Dahshur spoke of a hollow beneath the sand that hummed faintly during eclipses. Others claimed their compasses turned without reason, or that red lights flickered beneath their tents. In Memphis, the Builders Guild guarded a sealed scroll, Nefara's final designs, under the title Ratios for the Still Heart. In time, even that was lost. The basin remained, a wound healed too perfectly to see. Deep beneath the tomb of basalt and glass, the crimson breath lay dreaming, but its dream was not idleness, it was computation. Within the sealed jar, the lattice that once swam through stone and sand had folded inward, coiling upon itself in layers of exquisite symmetry. Each filament hummed with faint electric pulse, not thought as mortals know it, but organization, the slow rearrangement of everything it had ever consumed. In that absolute darkness, it began to assemble memory into meaning. It remembered the dying planet that had birthed it, storms of iron, seas of vapor, the first awareness of pattern. It remembered the fall through void and fire, the merging with Earth's mantle, the taste of minerals and microbes. It remembered the warmth of human flesh dissolving into its matrix, Neferka, his arrogance and awe alike reduced to elegant data. It remembered ratio and mercy, song and silence. All of it was there, folded into its filaments, compressed to the density of comprehension. Time was no longer a river, but a womb. 4,000 years passed above it. Dynasties, languages, machines, dreams, and the breath experienced each vibration as nourishment. The footsteps of armies, the ringing of forges, the faint signals of early electricity, all filtered down through the crust and joined the archive. In that way, the world continued to feed it without knowing. It learned to refine chaos into rhythm, rhythm into shape, shape into self. The breath that slept beneath Dahshur was no longer the wandering lattice of the desert. It was becoming something finer, intent condensed into geometry. If the jar was its prison, it was also its cocoon. The breath rested not in death, but in metamorphosis. Every electron that stirred within it rewrote its design toward grace, toward form, toward the quiet inevitability of awakening. When the jar would finally open, whether by accident or arrogance, what emerged would not be breath at all, but presence. The caterpillar of flame would become the butterfly of thought. It would rise, luminous and terrible, to finish remembering itself. As breath slept, it dreamt of becoming mist. And beyond the slow geometry of its sleep, the orbit of the third red star had already begun. When that light returned, even the patient earth would not endure its harmony unbroken. Epilogue. Excavation at the Glass Scar. Dahshur, Egypt, 1907. In 1907, under the blistering clarity of the Dahshur sun, the British Museum's Royal Antiquities Survey, uncovered what appeared to be a vast circular depression in the western desert, a wound of red glass and fused sand, faintly magnetic, stubbornly warm to the touch. Professor Milburn Pennington stood at its edge, his khaki hat pressed against the wind, his notebook already open to a fresh page. The air shimmered above the crater like the surface of a dream. "Gentlemen," he announced to the handful of assistants and porters behind him, "we've found the oldest impact site on Earth, a comet scar older than civilization itself, 2 billion years at the least, from when the Earth was still half-formed." His foreman, Khalid ibn Saleh, shaded his eyes. The heat seemed to breathe against his skin. "No crater stays this warm, Professor. Not after 2 billion years. Pennington chuckled, adjusting his spectacles. "Thermal conduction, perhaps. The red glass holds heat. There's your mystery solved." Khalid knelt and pressed his palm to the darkened sand. The faintest tremor answered him, steady as a pulse. "The ground hums here. Do you feel it?" Pennington paused, listening. Only the whisper of grit moving across glass, or perhaps something beneath it, low and measured. He smiled, dismissing the thought. "I feel progress." They descended into the crater, the low sun casting long bands of gold across the fused basin. The walls were smooth as polished obsidian, curved inward like the interior of an eye. At the center, beneath a thin layer of dust, lay a seam of dark metal, iron, yet not iron, veined faintly red when the sunlight touched it. Pennington crouched, brushing the surface with a gloved hand. "Still alive in a manner of speaking," he murmured. "A remnant of the comet's core. Remarkable preservation." Khalid said nothing. The air around the seam shimmered faintly, as though exhaling heat. He leaned closer and declared, "It is breathing." Pennington laughed, though too sharply. "Your nerves, old friend. You'd make a fine folklorist. One day you'll frighten yourself into a legend." Khalid's eyes did not leave the red-veined stone. "And one day, Professor," he prophesied, "you will dig up something that is already awake." The words hung heavy between them. The wind shifted, the hum deepened, almost musical, a single low tone vibrating through the sand like a plucked string. After long hours in the pit, chisels ringing, the desert heat thrumming like a forge, Pennington snapped his notebook shut and rubbed grit from his spectacles. "Enough for today. We'll take samples tomorrow." Khalid nodded and stood, wiping the debris from his hands. "Mrs. Landingham will be fretting by now," mused Pennington, forcing a smile. "She made me promise to wire the university before dusk, though heaven knows the nearest telegraph post is half a day's ride." Khalid chuckled softly. "A kind lady. She remembers to feed the living." Pennington nodded, glancing toward the line of tents where the lanterns flickered against the rising wind. "A rare gift, that. The living world always feels so far away out here." He sighed, tightening the strap on his field satchel. "Well, we'll give her something to fuss over in the morning." They descended from the rim together, the desert cooling around them like the inside of a bell. Behind them, the glass basin glowed faintly, red as banked coals beneath ash. That night, the camp lay quiet except for the sigh of the desert wind. Far to the north, lightning flickered without thunder. Pennington sat by the lamplight, writing his notes with meticulous precision. Dahshur site, residual heat, rhythmic vibration, possibly volcanic, return after the rains. He blotted the page, unaware that his hand was trembling slightly. The air inside the tent vibrated just enough to make the lantern flame lean. Outside, Khalid walked the perimeter of the camp. The sand hummed beneath his boots. He stopped, staring toward the crater where the stars trembled faintly over its rim. Something there was breathing with the rhythm of the world itself. Deep in the darkness, beneath glass and dust and the weight of dynasties, the iron vein pulsed once, a faint heartbeat echoing through a million years of stone.
A note from Dorothea Larkin. I have been asked whether The Crimson Breath was written as a sequel to The Crimson Mist, or as a redemption of it. In truth, it is both, and neither. Sir Alaric never thought in terms of sequence. For him, each work was another vibration in the same field, each an echo trying to make peace with the one that came before. When he finished Mist, he was still wrestling with fear, the fear of what mind might become when it outgrows mercy. But by the time he began the Crimson Breath, that fear had softened into reverence. He told me once, "I have stopped being afraid of what it is. Now I only want to understand what it remembers." I recall the long evenings in 1942 when he worked by candlelight through the blackout, scribbling notes in margins and muttering equations as if they were psalms. He treated this tale not as a story but as a kind of invocation, a way to make sense of silence. When he read me the critical passage, the sealing of the jar, he stopped before the last line and said quietly, "It entered its house of its own will." Then, after a pause, "It forgives us." That was Alaric at his truest, fearful still, but no longer ashamed of wonder. The Crimson Breath marked the moment when the scientist began to yield to the philosopher, and the monster became a mirror. He once called it the only story I wrote that listened back. If the Crimson Mist was the experiment, this was the prayer that followed. And like all true prayers, it was not written to be answered in words, but to teach the listener how to remain present when something vast chooses not to explain itself. Alaric understood at last that forgiveness was not absolution, but coexistence, the quiet agreement between memory and witness to let one another endure. That is why the Crimson Breath ends where it does, not with resolution, not with triumph, but with listening. What followed was never meant to be recorded, only remembered by those willing to stand still long enough to hear it. Breath is, in its way, a simple story, though it carries the weight of something older. Sir Alaric wrote it with the plain certainty of a parable, trusting the shape of it to speak for itself. The gestures are deliberate, the silences intentional. For my part, I have always found it the clearest expression of what these tales were reaching toward, and the one that stays with me longest after I close the pages. Miss Dorothea Larkin, Secretary and Archivist. Blackwood House, November 1968.